Hello, my name is Dave Katarya, and I'm a rising senior at the Westminster Schools in Atlanta. Type 2 diabetes is one of the fastest growing chronic diseases in the world, and it's no longer just an adult problem. Today, I'm going to share findings from a large scale study evaluating the effectiveness of early education in preventing diabetes in adolescents. This study analyzed data from more than 11,000 middle school students participating in a 2 year school based diabetes prevention program. And so the question I set out to answer when doing this research was, can we stop diabetes before it starts? Here's why the research matters. India has over 100 million people living with diabetes and another 136 million with prediabetes. In the United States alone, 1 in 5 adolescents is already at risk for prediabetes. And a more recent 2025 CDC data suggests that number now may be as high as 1 in 3. This rapid rise is driven in part by poor diet and food habits, inactivity, and increasing obesity. What makes adolescence so critical is that the behaviors formed between ages 11 through 13, what you eat, how much you move, they tend to stick. They often persist into adulthood, which means this window is one of the best opportunities we have for prevention. School based health programs exist across India and across the world, but here's the gap. There's very limited large scale evidence on whether these programs actually work, whether they change what students know, and what they do. And that's exactly what this study set out to measure. The study analyzed secondary data collected through Arogya World's Healthy Schools program in West Bengal, India. The program involved approximately 11,000 students between the ages of 11 and 13 across multiple school districts over a 2 year period from 2023 to 2025. The curriculum had previously reached more than 750,000 students across India and was delivered through a validated school based prevention model. And this is important context as it shows that this was not an untested or new program. In fact, it had already reached over 750,000 students across India. The methodology was straightforward. Students completed a pre survey before the curriculum began and then a post survey after the 2 year intervention. The same 25-question survey was used before and after the intervention to measure both knowledge and behavior. The questions further covered 5 subcategories. The first 3 were knowledge based: knowledge of nutrition, physical activity, and diabetes risk factors. The last 2 subcategories were behavior based: food habit behavior and physical activity behavior. Responses were scored on a 0 to 100 scale, and an aggregate score was calculated for each participant. The pre and post intervention changes were statistically analyzed. The goal was to measure a change in both key metrics, not just what students knew, but what they actually did. The intervention produced substantial improvements across every metric we measured. Overall scores increased from 53 to 82%, a 29-point improvement. Knowledge scores jumped from 65 to 98%, while behavior scores improved from 41 to 68%. However, one of the most significant findings was the reduction in low performing participants. Before the intervention, more than 2,700 students, or a quarter of all participants, were classified as poor performers, meaning that they scored below 49% overall initially. After the intervention, that number dropped to just 35 students. That is a whopping 98.7% reduction in poor performers. Statistical testing confirmed these improvements were highly significant with a large effect size. And when we break it down, by category, we could see where the biggest changes happen. Knowledge of diabetes risk factors had the most dramatic gain. Students came in with very little awareness of what actually caused diabetes and left with near complete understanding. Physical activity behaviors showed the largest absolute jump of any category, from 25 to 86. Students were moving more, spending more time outdoors, and engaging in more active play. Nutrition knowledge was already relatively high, going in at 79, which tells us students had some basic awareness. But even that improved to over 97. The program strengthened what students already knew and built entirely new understanding where gaps existed. One of the most interesting findings of this study for public health was the gap between knowledge improvement and behavior change. Post program knowledge scores reached approximately 98%, while behavior scores reached about 68%. In other words, students learned the material very effectively, but changing long term habits proved to be more difficult. For example, many students understood that fried snacks increase diabetes risk, yet their food habits were harder to change. Why? Because food choices aren't made in a vacuum. They're shaped by family routines, cultural traditions, and what's available at home. We could teach a child something is unhealthy, but we can't always change what's on their dinner table. I witnessed this firsthand in a small pilot program that we ran in Atlanta that I will talk about on the next slide. However, this doesn't diminish the results. A 26-point improvement in behavior is still very significant. And while behavior scores did not improve as dramatically as knowledge scores, the results suggest that knowledge may serve as an important foundation for future behavior change. Inspired by these findings, we launched a small pilot program called Arogia Clubs in Atlanta. It's currently serving 30 middle schoolers from the Agape Youth Center, focusing specifically on high risk Latino and African American youth communities. What's different about this model is that it's peer led. High school students design and deliver the curriculum. And critically, to address the behavior gap we just discussed, peer leaders cook and serve healthy meals at every session, putting behavioral changes into practice and not just on a worksheet. This is early stage, but it's a direct attempt to take what the India data taught us and test it in a new context. So, what can we take away from all this? Firstly, early school based interventions can produce significant, measurable improvements in diabetes related knowledge and behavior in adolescents. The data is very clear on that. Second, behavior change is much harder than knowledge gain, which means most programs need sustained engagement and not just one time lessons. I also want to highlight a key limitation. This study used a pre post design without a control group, which means we could show strong association but not definitive causation. Future control studies are needed to fully establish that relationship and, more importantly, to track whether these improvements hold over time. The Atlanta pilot suggests peer led models are worth exploring further. So, the big picture, early intervention leads to better habits, and better habits lower future risk. Thank you so much for your time, and please feel free to contact me on the email I provided at the bottom of the screen with any questions or feedback. Thank you so much.